Sarah followed Kane across the gravel-strewn ground, her boots crunching with each step, and the weight of her medical bag a constant reminder of her purpose. She watched the SEALs moving like shadows around the perimeter, communicating silently with hand signals and glances. The wind carried the faint smell of smoke and dust, and somewhere in the distance, a mortar exploded, sending a plume into the sky. She felt her pulse quicken and tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself that her mission was to heal, not fight. Yet the instinct to act ran through her like electricity. Kane stopped near a cluster of armored vehicles and crouched, his eyes scanning the horizon before locking on hers. His expression was unreadable, but there was a spark there, a test perhaps, or a silent acknowledgement that he knew she was more than she appeared. Sarah nodded almost imperceptibly and checked her equipment, making sure everything was ready. The radios crackled again, bringing urgent messages of movement and a possible ambush on the supply route. Her stomach tightened at the thought of more casualties, and she knew that soon she would be called to act in ways she had not imagined. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the dusty ground, and Sarah could feel the tension in the air like a living thing. She crouched behind the armored vehicle next to Kane and watched as a team of SEALs approached a damaged building, the sound of their boots muffled by the dirt and rubble. Sarah tried to memorize every angle, every potential danger zone, knowing that she would have to move fast if the situation turned deadly. Suddenly a shout echoed from the compound. A soldier was down, and Sarah felt her training kick in as she grabbed her medkit and sprinted toward the cries. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the dust stung her eyes, but she did not stop. She arrived to find the soldier bleeding heavily and the SEALs providing cover fire. Sarah knelt and began administering aid, her hands moving with precision despite the chaos around her. Gunfire cracked and the ground shook with the echo of explosions. She caught a glimpse of Kane directing other SEALs silently, and she knew he was watching her every move. The wind shifted and carried the sound of approaching boots. Sarah looked up and saw shadows moving closer and a flicker of movement that did not belong to her team. A cold fear ran down her spine as she realized that the situation was far from over. The soldier in front of her whimpered, and she felt the weight of responsibility crushing down. Her fingers worked the bandages and syringes faster as the shadows drew nearer, and the hum of tension wrapped around her like a tightening noose. Sarah knew that whatever came next would test everything she had learned and everything she thought she could handle, and she could feel the first stirrings of a battle that would not be fought by anyone else alone. The sound of boots grew louder, and Sarah kept her head down, her hands steady as she worked on the wounded soldier. The smoke from distant explosions mixed with dust, and the acrid smell of gunpowder making it hard to breathe, but she ignored it, focusing on the life in front of her. Each second stretched endlessly, and she could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Suddenly Kane appeared at her side, moving with silent precision, his eyes scanning the perimeter for threats. He crouched beside her and whispered instructions in a tone that carried both authority and urgency. Sarah nodded, though her hands never stopped their work. The soldier gasped, and she adjusted a tourniquet. Just as a shadow moved at the edge of her vision, she turned slightly, catching a glimpse of a hostile figure disappearing behind a wall. Her stomach tightened and instinct screamed that she could not just stay on the ground and wait. More gunfire erupted, and she felt the sting of shrapnel in her sleeve, but she ignored. The SEALs were coordinating silently around her, moving with fluid efficiency, and she realized that she was in the middle of a storm far larger than she had imagined. Kane signaled, and Sarah picked up her medkit, ready to move with the team. She ran toward the compound, following his lead, weaving between craters and debris, her eyes scanning constantly for danger. A soldier yelled something, and she froze for a split second before realizing it was a friendly. She helped lift another wounded teammate into cover and felt the adrenaline surge in her veins. Her role as healer seemed small compared to the chaos around her, yet every action counted. Each step forward was met with gunfire, and she ducked instinctively while trying to keep her patient calm. Kane glanced at her briefly and gave a subtle nod that she had understood his silent command. The team advanced slowly, each movement calculated and deadly. She realized that her hands were shaking, not from fear but from the intensity of the situation. The wind shifted again, carrying new sounds that made her heart skip a beat. She spotted movement in a window of the building ahead, and new enemies were preparing to strike. The soldiers around her tensed, and she could feel the energy shift like a living thing waiting for the spark that would ignite the fight. Sarah took a deep breath, checking her medical supplies and preparing herself for the possibility that she would need to protect the lives she was tending to. Her eyes met Kane's for a moment, and in that glance she felt a silent understanding that the line between healer and fighter was about to blur. The shadow in the window moved closer, and the first shot rang out. Sarah ducked instinctively, her hands clutching her medkit as if it could shield her from what was coming. She knew that nothing in her training had fully prepared her for the choice she would have to make next. The first shot echoed through the compound, and Sarah dropped low, her hands gripping the medkit as her instincts screamed at her to stay down. The wounded soldier whimpered beside her, and she pressed a cloth to the gash on his arm, while her eyes never left the broken windows and shattered walls around them. The seals moved like shadows, fluid and precise around her, clearing rooms and providing cover fire while Kane signaled from a low vantage point, directing the flow of battle silently and efficiently. Sarah felt her heart hammering in her chest, adrenaline coursing through her veins, making every nerve stand at attention. She could hear the distant roar of an engine, and the thump of mortar rounds striking not far from where she knelt. The chaos was overwhelming, and yet a strange clarity settled over her. She knew that lives depended on her, and that hesitation could cost everything. The soldier she tended to looked up, eyes wide and scared, and she whispered reassurances even as she felt the tremor of fear inside herself. A sudden movement to her left made her whip around just in time to see a hostile combatant charging from the shadows. Without thinking, she raised her medkit and swung it, instinctively knocking the man off balance. He stumbled, and she seized the moment to push him away, keeping her patience safe around her. Gunfire cracked and bullets ricocheted, sending sparks off walls and metal. Sarah felt the sting of dust and debris hitting her face, but she ignored it. Kane called out a silent command, and she understood the signal. Without words, she was to provide cover while he and another SEAL advanced further into the building. She moved to a small corner, peeking through a shattered doorway, and spotted the silhouette of another enemy combatant aiming a rifle at her team. Her training as a medic had never included aiming a weapon, but her instincts screamed at her that she had to act. She picked up a fallen rifle and aimed shakily, her finger on the trigger as Kane covered her advance. She squeezed and the shot rang out, hitting the target, and Sarah stumbled back, shocked at her own actions, and at the realization that she had just crossed a line. The SEALs rushed forward, and the enemy retreated, leaving the room eerily silent except for the groans of the injured. Sarah knelt again to tend to her patient, hands shaking as she worked, but Kane was at her side, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder and nodding approvingly. The compound was far from secure, and every shadow could hold another threat. She felt the weight of responsibility crushing her chest, and knew that the next moments could demand even more than courage. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of more movement and distant shouts, and Sarah knew that nothing in the coming fight would be predictable. The room was thick with dust and the smell of smoke. Sarah's hands were still shaking from her first shot, and yet Kane's eyes held a look that told her she had done the right thing. The SEALs were moving cautiously, clearing the next corridor, and Sarah followed, keeping low and her medkit close, but her mind racing with the knowledge that she had just stepped onto a path she had never trained for. The distant thump of mortars continued, and each echo made her heart skip a beat. Suddenly Kane signaled and motioned toward a window that overlooked the courtyard. Sarah crouched beside him, her pulse hammering in her ears, and saw movement at the far edge of the compound. Hostiles were regrouping, taking cover behind crates and debris. Kane whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "You cover me, Sarah," and handed her his Barrett sniper rifle. Her eyes went wide, and she shook her head. "This is not your fight," he said. "Your skill matters now more than you think." Her fingers closed around the cold metal of the rifle, and a shock of fear mixed with adrenaline ran through her. She had never fired a weapon like this before, yet the weight in her hands felt oddly natural. Kane pointed to a target and nodded once. Her training in observation and precision from her medical skills translated in ways she had never imagined. Sarah took a deep breath, her finger brushing the trigger. The first shot rang out, echoing across the compound, and the target dropped. Instantly, the other SEALs froze, momentarily astonished, and then resumed their advance, while Sarah kept her focus, scanning for threats. Her eyes locked on another figure moving along the perimeter. She adjusted her aim and squeezed the trigger, sending another enemy down. Her confidence surged, but so did the fear, because each shot reminded her that she was now part of the fight, not just a healer. She crouched behind cover, assessing the wounded soldiers in the courtyard, and quickly prioritized their injuries, her hands moving with practiced precision while her eyes constantly scanned for danger. Kane moved past her, signaling the next target, and she adjusted her position, feeling the rifle settle in her shoulder like an extension of herself. She realized that every second counted, every movement could save or cost lives. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of distant shouting and gunfire, and Sarah knew the enemy would not stay down for long. She felt the weight of Kane's trust heavy on her shoulders, and the responsibility of lives in her hands crushing yet exhilarating. A shadow moved near the wall, closer than expected, and her finger tightened on the trigger as she prepared to fire again, knowing that whatever came next would test every ounce of courage and skill she possessed. The SEALs advanced through the compound, their presence a blur of deadly efficiency, and Sarah felt the first true taste of what it meant to be both healer and fighter in the midst of a war where hesitation could mean death. The courtyard was a battlefield. Sarah stayed low behind the shattered wall, her Barrett cradled in her arms, and her eyes sweeping constantly for movement. Every shadow could conceal a threat, every sound carried the warning of danger. The SEALs advanced with silent coordination, clearing rooms and covering each other while Sarah provided overwatch, taking careful shots that dropped enemies before they could strike. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins and the dust that scratched at her eyes. The wounded groaned, and she moved quickly between them, checking vitals, applying bandages, and keeping morale steady even as bullets ricocheted off metal and concrete around her. Kane directed the team, signaling with hand gestures and glances, his confidence in her growing with each successful shot. She felt a strange mixture of fear and power, knowing that her role had shifted entirely from healer to something more necessary, more lethal. The enemy regrouped behind a crumbling wall at the far end of the courtyard. Sarah adjusted the scope of the Barrett, focusing on the target. Kane motioned once, and she exhaled sharply, squeezing the trigger, sending the enemy crashing to the ground. The SEALs moved forward, taking advantage of the window she had created, and she ducked instinctively as return fire crackled around her. The wind carried the distant echo of explosions and shouting, making it hard to focus, but she trained herself to see only what mattered. The injured soldier she had first tended to was crying softly, and she knelt beside him, whispering reassurances while keeping an eye on the shadows that could conceal more danger. Kane approached quickly, signaling another threat, and she moved without hesitation, firing again with precision. Her mind was racing, calculating trajectories, positions, and priorities, while her hands acted on muscle memory and instinct. She realized that every decision she made could save a life or end one, and the weight of that knowledge pressed on her chest. The courtyard was littered with debris, bodies, and the remnants of shattered walls, but still the fight was far from over. A movement near the supply crates caught her eye, and she fired again, taking down a combatant who had tried to flank the SEALs. Her breath was shallow and ragged, but she did not stop. Each shot was measured, each action deliberate and necessary. Kane signaled the team to regroup, and she helped pull a wounded SEAL to cover, checking his injuries before returning to her position with the Barrett. The enemy had not yet given up, and she knew the next wave would be closer, faster, and more dangerous. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint sound of running boots and shouted commands, and Sarah gripped the rifle tighter, preparing herself for the moment when she would have to act again, knowing that hesitation could be deadly, and that the line between healer and fighter had vanished completely. The fortified compound loomed ahead like a silent predator. Sarah crouched behind the rubble, her Barrett resting on her shoulder, scanning every angle for movement. The SEALs moved with fluid precision, clearing the perimeter, silently signaling and communicating with subtle gestures that she struggled to keep up with. Her heart pounded in her chest, and adrenaline made her fingers tingle as she adjusted the scope and searched for threats. Each moment was a test of focus and endurance. Bullets ricocheted off walls, sending sparks into the air, while distant explosions shook the ground beneath her feet. Kane crouched beside her, silently assessing the situation, and she could feel his trust like a tangible weight pressing down on her. She swallowed hard, reminding herself that she was both healer and fighter now, and every decision mattered. She spotted movement near the wall, a shadow slipping between crates, and she squeezed the trigger, her shot precise and deadly. The enemy faltered, and the SEALs seized the advantage, moving closer to breach the compound. Sarah felt a strange surge of exhilaration mixed with terror as she ducked behind a broken pillar. The sound of groaning and shouting filled the courtyard, and she knelt to check on a wounded SEAL, applying bandages quickly while keeping her eyes scanning for more danger. Kane signaled again, pointing toward the compound entrance, and she understood instantly she was to provide cover for the breach team. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, switching between the rifle and medkit as needed. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of smoke and gunpowder, and Sarah felt the weight of responsibility crushing her chest. A new enemy appeared on the rooftop. Her heart leapt, and she raised the Barrett, aiming carefully. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and the shot rang out, echoing across the compound. The enemy went down, and for a brief moment she allowed herself a breath. Her eyes flicked to Kane, who gave a subtle nod of approval before disappearing around the corner with the team. Sarah crouched low, scanning for more threats and tending to the injured, her mind a whirlwind of calculations, instincts, and fear. The courtyard was littered with debris, bodies, and shattered equipment, yet the fight was far from over. A sudden movement behind a stack of crates made her spin, firing instinctively, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. The SEALs advanced methodically, clearing rooms and securing exits while she provided critical support, both lethal and life-saving. The distant hum of helicopters grew louder, signaling possible extraction or reinforcements. Sarah knew that every second counted, every decision could tip the balance. The wind shifted again, carrying shouts and footsteps closer, and she gripped the rifle tighter, preparing herself for the moment that would demand everything she had learned and everything she was yet to discover in this war where hesitation could mean death. Sarah pressed forward with the seals into the heart of the compound, her senses stretched to the limit, each sound, shadow, and movement analyzed and calculated. Her barret rested heavy in her hands, but she felt an odd confidence in its weight, knowing that precision now meant life or death around her. The team moved like shadows, clearing rooms and hallways, while she stayed close, ready to tend the injured and strike if necessary. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the scent of gunpowder, and Sarah could hear the groans of the wounded mingling with the distant thump of explosions. Each step brought them closer to the core of the compound, where the high-value target was rumored to be hiding. Kane moved silently ahead, signaling and clearing paths with deadly efficiency, and Sarah followed, keeping low and scanning constantly. The walls were riddled with bullet holes and the floors slick with dust and debris, making each step a challenge. Her hands were steady as she administered aid to a seal hit in the leg while keeping her eyes on a window where shadows flickered. A sudden shout rang out from the far end of the hallway, and the team froze for a fraction of a second before Kane signaled to advance. Sarah raised the barret, instinctively taking down an enemy attempting to flank them. The seals surged forward, clearing the corridor. While she ducked behind a support beam, her pulse hammering in her ears, she moved quickly to check on another wounded teammate. Applying a tourniquet and adrenaline made her hands move faster than thought. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of reinforcements approaching from the compound entrance. Sarah peeked through a doorway, spotting movement, and fired a careful shot, dropping another enemy before retreating to cover. Kane gestured for the team to split, moving through separate corridors, and Sarah followed the smaller group. She found herself in a narrow hallway littered with rubble and dust. Her heart raced and every nerve screamed at her to stay alert. She spotted a shadow at the far end, a combatant preparing to strike, and her finger tightened on the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing off walls, and the enemy fell. Sarah exhaled slowly, but her relief was short-lived as another figure appeared around the corner. She moved quickly to cover a wounded seal, dragging him to a safer spot while keeping an eye on the advancing threat. Kane reappeared, signaling her to hold position and provide overwatch. The courtyard outside was visible through shattered windows, and she could see the remaining enemies regrouping, preparing to counterattack. Her stomach twisted with tension and anticipation, knowing that the next moments would determine who survived and who fell. She adjusted her grip on the barret, breathing steadily and preparing for the wave of danger approaching faster and closer than ever. The standoff in the courtyard was tense. Sarah crouched behind a shattered wall, her barret resting steady in her arms, while her eyes scanned every movement across the open space. The seals moved with precision, covering each other and clearing lines of sight, while she provided overwatch, picking targets with calm focus. Despite the pounding of her heart around her, groans of the wounded and the crackle of distant gunfire mingled, creating a symphony of chaos that she had learned to navigate with skill and instinct. Kane signaled to the team to advance toward the fortified building at the far end, and Sarah adjusted her position, taking careful shots at anyone attempting to approach. The wind carried the scent of smoke and dust, and each breath was sharp in her lungs. She moved quickly to check on a soldier hit near the perimeter, applying pressure to a wound while keeping her eyes scanning for threats. The enemy had not yet given up, and shadows moved between crates and debris. Sarah squeezed the trigger, dropping another combatant before ducking behind cover. The seals cleared the courtyard methodically, while Kane signaled for her to cover the breach. She moved toward a shattered doorway, providing suppressive fire, while another wounded teammate whimpered beneath her hands. She kept the tourniquet tight, and her focus razor sharp. Her pulse was steady despite the chaos, and she realized that every decision could mean life or death. The courtyard erupted as enemy reinforcements attempted to flank the seals. Sarah fired with precision, taking down targets one after another while dragging the injured to safer positions. Kane advanced, signaling her to cover the team as they prepared to breach the final entrance. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility crushing her chest, yet exhilarating her in a way she had never known. She peeked through the broken doorway, spotting multiple figures preparing to ambush, and her finger tightened on the trigger, sending shots downrange with deadly accuracy. Each impact echoed across the courtyard, and the remaining enemies faltered, giving the seals the advantage. She crouched low, her eyes scanning the debris for new threats while tending to the injured, applying medical skills with steady hands. The wind shifted, carrying distant shouts and the hum of approaching helicopters signaling possible extraction. Sarah exhaled slowly, her body tense, every nerve alert as the enemy regrouped for a final assault. She adjusted her aim again, ready to act. The line between healer and fighter completely erased. Her heart hammered in her chest and adrenaline surged through her veins, knowing that the next few moments would decide the fate of the team, and that hesitation could mean death for everyone in the courtyard. The seals were ready to move. Kane signaled one last time, and Sarah prepared herself, knowing that what came next would demand everything she had learned and everything she was yet to discover in the firestorm that surrounded them. The final push into the compound was a blur of motion and noise. Sarah moved with the seals through shattered hallways and smoke-filled rooms, her Barrett steady in her hands while her eyes scanned for movement. Every sound carried a warning, every shadow a potential threat. The wounded groaned beside her, and she administered aid quickly, while keeping her focus razor-sharp. Kane led the team with silent efficiency, signaling directions and targets as the enemy fought back fiercely. Bullets cracked and ricocheted off walls, sending sparks into the air, and Sarah ducked instinctively, her pulse hammering. She spotted movement near a staircase and fired with precision, dropping an enemy before moving to cover a wounded SEAL, who whimpered under her hands. The wind carried the distant hum of reinforcements, and she knew they had limited time. The courtyard beyond the hallways was littered with debris, bodies, and shattered equipment, and she could see the remaining hostiles regrouping, preparing for a counterattack. Sarah squeezed the trigger again, taking down a figure attempting to flank the team. Her hands moved with practiced precision, switching between rifle and medkit as necessary. Her breath was shallow and rapid, but her mind remained clear, calculating the path forward. Each step closer to the high-value target increased the danger, and the weight of responsibility pressed down on her chest. Kane signaled for the team to split, moving through separate corridors, and Sarah followed the smaller group into a narrow hallway, debris littering the floor, making every movement a challenge. She spotted shadows at the far end, preparing to strike, and fired again, dropping another enemy before crouching low behind cover. The wounded cried softly, and she applied tourniquets and bandages as bullets whizzed past. Her body was tense, every nerve on edge, yet she felt a strange calm, knowing that hesitation could mean death. The team surged forward, clearing rooms with deadly efficiency, while Sarah provided critical overwatch, taking out targets that threatened the SEALs. She peeked through a doorway, spotting multiple figures attempting an ambush, and fired carefully one by one. Her focus narrowed to the point where nothing else existed except the next breath, the next shot, the next movement. Kane signaled to advance, and she moved with him, providing cover and tending the injured. Her pulse roared in her ears, adrenaline and fear mixing into a single sharp edge. The sound of distant helicopters grew louder, signaling extraction or reinforcements, and Sarah knew that the mission hung by a thread. Every decision, every shot, every movement could tip the balance, and she gripped the Barrett tighter, ready to act again, knowing that the final moments of the operation were upon them, and that courage alone would not be enough to survive the storm that surrounded them. The final moments of the mission were a blur. Sarah pressed forward with Kane and the SEALs into the heart of the compound, her Barrett ready, and her eyes scanning for the high-value target. The wounded groaned around her, and she administered aid with hands steady despite the chaos. Bullets cracked and ricocheted, sending sparks into the air, and every sound carried the warning of danger. She moved quickly to cover a SEAL pinned down behind rubble, adjusting her aim and squeezing the trigger, dropping an enemy before dragging him to safety. The team advanced with deadly precision, clearing rooms and hallways while Sarah provided overwatch, tending the injured and striking with accuracy. When threats emerged, the courtyard ahead was littered with debris and bodies, and the remaining hostiles were regrouping, preparing for a final desperate counterattack. Sarah exhaled sharply, steadying her nerves. Her heart pounded in her chest, adrenaline and fear coursing through her veins. Every second counted, every decision could mean life or death. Kane signaled to the team to breach the final building, and Sarah moved with him, covering every angle. The high-value target was inside, and the tension was suffocating. She crouched behind a shattered wall, scanning the interior with the Barrett, her finger ready. Her training as a medic had never prepared her for this level of danger, yet instinct and adrenaline guided her every action. The enemy appeared at the far end of the room, attempting to flank the SEALs, and Sarah fired, dropping them instantly. Her breath was shallow, but her focus remained sharp. She moved to tend to another wounded teammate while keeping her eyes on the remaining threats. Kane gestured, and she understood. They were moments away from completing the mission. The enemy made one last desperate push. Sarah squeezed the trigger, taking down 2 combatants before ducking behind cover. Her pulse roared in her ears, and she realized that she had fully embraced both roles, healer and fighter. Her hands were steady as she applied a tourniquet to a SEAL hit in the shoulder, while her eyes tracked movement in the shadows outside the compound. The hum of helicopters grew louder, signaling extraction. The SEALs moved swiftly, securing the target and clearing the building. Sarah fired one last precise shot at a hostile attempting to escape. Then Kane signaled that the area was secure, and Sarah exhaled slowly, relief and exhaustion washing over her. She looked at the team, the SEALs nodding in approval and gratitude, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel pride. Her transformation was complete. She was no longer just a medic, she was a vital part of the team, capable of both healing and fighting. She lowered the Barrett and helped carry the wounded toward the extraction point. The wind carried the sound of distant explosions, fading as the helicopters approached. Sarah glanced at Kane, who gave a subtle nod and a rare smile, and she knew that she had earned their trust and respect. The mission was over, but the memory of the chaos, the fear, and the courage would stay with her forever. And as she boarded the helicopter, she realized that nothing in her life would ever be the same again.